Captain Jake Morrison had been flying helicopters for the Army for 12 years, but he'd never experienced anything like what happened on that foggy Tuesday morning in Afghanistan. The mission was supposed to be routine, a supply drop to Forward Operating Base Delta, nestled in the mountains near the Pakistan border. Jake's crew consisted of his co-pilot Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez, Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant Tommy Chen, and Door Gunner Specialist Alex Thompson. They'd flown together for 8 months, developing the kind of trust that kept them alive in hostile territory. The Black Hawk lifted off from Bagram Airfield at 6:30 hours, loaded with medical supplies, ammunition, and letters from home. Jake had done this route dozens of times, threading through the mountain passes with practiced ease. The weather was challenging, thick fog rolling through the valleys, but nothing they couldn't handle. Maria monitored the instruments while Tommy kept watch on the cargo, ensuring everything was secure. The radio chatter was minimal, just routine check-ins with air traffic control. Halfway through the flight, something felt wrong. Jake noticed the helicopter's response seemed sluggish, and there was a subtle vibration in the controls that hadn't been there during pre-flight checks. He mentioned it to Maria, who immediately began running diagnostics. The instruments showed everything normal, but Jake's instincts, honed by years of combat flying, told him otherwise. He reduced altitude slightly, bringing them closer to the valley floor where they could make an emergency landing if necessary. That's when the first burst of enemy fire erupted from the ridgeline. Jake saw the muzzle flashes before he heard the distinctive crack of AK-47s. He immediately initiated evasive maneuvers, banking hard left while Tommy returned fire from the door gun. The helicopter shuddered as rounds struck the fuselage, and warning lights began flashing across the instrument panel. Maria was already calling for immediate assistance, her voice calm and professional despite the chaos. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Blackbird 7-2. We are taking heavy fire at grid reference 427893. We have multiple hits and are experiencing mechanical failure. Request immediate air support and medical evacuation standby." Jake fought to maintain control as the helicopter began losing altitude. The engine was sputtering, and he could smell smoke in the cabin. More gunfire erupted from multiple positions, suggesting they'd flown into a well-planned ambush. Alex continued laying down suppressive fire, his M240 machine gun chattering as he swept the ridgelines. Tommy was rapidly assessing the damage, checking fuel lines and electrical systems. "We're losing hydraulics," he shouted over the noise, "and I think we took a hit to the tail rotor." Jake felt the confirmation in his controls. The helicopter was becoming increasingly difficult to manage, yawing unpredictably as they descended toward the narrow valley floor. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. They were taking fire from at least 3 positions. The helicopter was barely flyable, and they were losing altitude fast. Jake spotted a small clearing ahead, barely large enough for an emergency landing. It would have to do. He keyed his radio, knowing this might be their last transmission before going down in hostile territory. Maria continued coordinating with command, providing their exact location and status updates. The professionalism in her voice never wavered, even as the helicopter shook violently from more incoming fire. Jake knew they had minutes, maybe less, before they'd be on the ground and fighting for their lives. The mountain peaks rose around them like the walls of a tomb, and the enemy fire seemed to be coming from everywhere. This was about to become a very long day. The clearing rushed up to meet them as Jake fought to control their descent. He could see enemy fighters moving through the rocks, positioning themselves for when the helicopter hit the ground. The Black Hawk's engine was dying, hydraulics failing, and they were essentially flying a several-ton projectile toward Earth. Jake's hands moved with practiced precision, using every bit of his experience to bring them down as safely as possible under impossible circumstances. As they touched down hard in the rocky clearing, Jake knew their real fight was just beginning. The helicopter was damaged beyond repair. They were outnumbered by an unknown number of enemy fighters, and their only hope was the rescue mission that Maria had called in. He looked at his crew, Maria checking her rifle, Tommy grabbing the radio equipment, Alex already scanning for targets through the smoke. They were good soldiers, and they'd need every bit of their training to survive what was coming next. The helicopter came to rest at an awkward angle, its rotor blades striking rocks and sending debris flying. Jake shut down the remaining systems and grabbed his M4 carbine. Through the smoke and dust, he could see muzzle flashes getting closer. The enemy had been waiting for them, and now they were trapped in a valley with limited cover and no way out except on foot. The nearest friendly forces were miles away, and the terrain was unforgiving even under the best circumstances. Tommy had managed to save the radio, and he was already trying to establish contact with command. The helicopter's main communication system was damaged, but they had backup equipment. If they could get word out about their exact situation, maybe the rescue team would have a better chance of finding them. Jake positioned himself behind a large boulder, scanning the ridgelines for enemy movement. The fog was both blessing and curse. It concealed them from long-range fire but also hid their attackers. Maria had found a defensive position about 20 meters away, her medical training making her invaluable if anyone got wounded. Alex was using the helicopter's bulk as cover, his machine gun ready to provide suppressive fire if the enemy tried to rush their position. The four of them formed a loose perimeter around the crash site, each covering a different approach. Jake knew they couldn't stay here long. The enemy would eventually coordinate an assault that would overwhelm their limited ammunition and defensive positions. The radio crackled with static, and Tommy's voice cut through the tension. "I've got something," he said, adjusting the frequency. "Weak signal, but it's definitely military." Jake felt a surge of hope. If they could establish reliable communication, they might have a chance. The enemy fire had temporarily decreased, suggesting they were regrouping for a coordinated attack. This brief respite might be their only opportunity to call for help and establish a plan for either rescue or escape. The static continued, punctuated by occasional bursts of unintelligible voices. Tommy worked frantically with the radio, trying different frequencies and adjusting the antenna. Jake divided his attention between watching for enemy movement and monitoring Tommy's progress. Every second counted now. The fog was beginning to lift, which would make them more visible to their attackers, but might also help rescue aircraft locate them. It was a double-edged sword that could determine whether they lived or died. Jake's mind raced through their options. They had limited ammunition, no heavy weapons, and were surrounded by unknown numbers of enemy fighters in familiar territory. The helicopter was completely destroyed, so extraction would have to be by ground vehicle or another aircraft. The mountainous terrain made ground evacuation extremely difficult, and the enemy fire would complicate any air rescue attempt. They needed a miracle, and they needed it fast. The radio suddenly burst with clearer sound, not quite intelligible but definitely more than static. Tommy's eyes lit up as he fine-tuned the frequency. "This is it," he whispered. "I think I've got command." Jake moved closer, keeping his rifle ready while listening intently. If they could establish communication, they might be able to coordinate their defense with an incoming rescue mission. The enemy had gone quiet, which was somehow more ominous than the gunfire had been. Maria signaled from her position, pointing toward the eastern ridge. Jake could see movement, figures in earth-colored clothing moving carefully through the rocks. They were being methodical, professional, not the wild rush he might have expected from irregular fighters. This suggested they were dealing with experienced combatants who knew how to coordinate an assault. The situation was getting worse by the minute, and their window for rescue was rapidly closing. Tommy suddenly straightened up, his face breaking into a grin. "I've got them," he said, his voice filled with relief. "Command is on the line." Jake felt a surge of hope as Tommy handed him the radio handset. After what felt like hours of being cut off from the world, they finally had a lifeline. But even as he took the radio, Jake could see more enemy fighters moving into position. They were running out of time, and the rescue mission would have to be perfect to succeed. The voice on the other end was professional and calm, asking for their status and exact location. Jake provided the information quickly while scanning the ridgelines for threats. The enemy seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps the fog to lift completely, or maybe they were coordinating a simultaneous assault from multiple directions. Either way, Jake knew they couldn't hold this position indefinitely. They needed extraction, and they needed it within the next few minutes. As he finished his report to command, Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors echoing through the valley. For a moment, he thought it might be their rescue, but the sound was wrong, too light, too fast. It was an enemy helicopter, probably coming to coordinate the ground assault or provide air support for the fighters surrounding them. Their situation had just gone from desperate to nearly hopeless. Maria's voice cut through the noise of the approaching aircraft. "Contact front," she called out, her rifle already tracking targets. The enemy fighters were moving, using the distraction of the helicopter to close distance. Jake could see at least a dozen figures advancing through the rocks, their weapons ready. This was it, the final assault. Tommy was still working the radio, trying to guide in their rescue, while Alex prepared to engage the aircraft with his machine gun. The enemy helicopter appeared over the ridge, a Soviet-era Mi-24 Hind gunship that looked like it had seen better days but was still deadly effective. It hovered about 500 meters away, its pilot probably assessing the situation before engaging. Jake knew they had no effective weapons against it. Their small arms fire would be useless against its armor. The ground assault was about to begin, and they'd have air support backing it up. That's when Jake heard something impossible through the radio static. A voice he recognized, speaking in clear, unaccented English. "Blackbird 7-2, this is Guardian Angel. We have your position and are inbound. Keep your heads down and mark your location with colored smoke if you have it." Jake's heart leaped. Guardian Angel was the call sign for the elite rescue squadron based at Bagram. They were coming, but would they arrive in time? The enemy fighters were now within 100 meters, and the helicopter was beginning to orbit their position. Jake could see the door gunner preparing to fire. Tommy was screaming into the radio, trying to coordinate with the rescue team while Alex engaged the ground targets. Maria was providing covering fire from her position, her shots carefully placed to slow the enemy advance. They were fighting for every second now, hopping to survive long enough for help to arrive. The Hind suddenly opened fire, its cannons raking the area around the crashed Black Hawk. Jake threw himself behind the boulder as rounds sparked off the rocks around him. The noise was deafening and debris filled the air. When he looked up, he saw that Alex had been hit, not seriously, but enough to limit his effectiveness. They were down to 3 fully functional fighters against overwhelming odds. Through the chaos, Jake heard the radio crackle again. The same calm voice from Guardian Angel. "Blackbird 7-2, we are 2 minutes out. We have A-10 support inbound as well. Can you maintain your position?" Jake keyed the radio while firing at advancing enemies. "Negative, Guardian Angel. We are about to be overrun. Enemy helicopter in the area, multiple ground targets closing fast." The response came immediately, and Jake could hear the determination in the pilot's voice. "Copy that, Blackbird 7-2. We're coming in hot. Mark your position now." Tommy popped a red smoke grenade, and the bright red smoke began billowing up from their position. Jake prayed that Guardian Angel would distinguish them from the enemy fighters, some of whom were now close enough to throw grenades. The enemy helicopter was making another pass, its cannons preparing to fire again. Jake knew they couldn't survive another direct attack. The ground fighters were advancing under covering fire, and their ammunition was running low. This was the moment when everything would be decided. The next 60 seconds would determine whether they lived or died. Then Jake heard it, the distinctive sound of American helicopters approaching fast. Not just one, but multiple aircraft. Through the noise and confusion, he could make out the voice from Guardian Angel getting clearer and stronger. Blackbird 7-2, we have visual on your smoke. Get ready for immediate extraction. We're coming in now. The rescue helicopters appeared over the ridge like avenging angels, their door gunners already engaging the enemy positions. Jake watched in amazement as A-10 Warthogs screamed overhead, their 13 cannons decimating the enemy helicopter before it could fire another shot. The ground shook from the impact of the A-10's cannon fire, and the enemy fighters began falling back under the intense air support. Guardian Angel settled into the clearing with practiced precision, its crew chief already motioning for Jake's team to move. Tommy helped Alex toward the helicopter while Maria provided covering fire. Jake was the last to board, making sure his team was safe before jumping into the cabin. As they lifted off, he could see the enemy fighters retreating through the rocks, their assault broken by the sudden arrival of American air power. The flight back to Bagram was a blur of medical attention for Alex and debriefing questions from the rescue crew. Jake learned that Guardian Angel had been airborne within minutes of receiving their distress call, but the weather and enemy fire had delayed their arrival. The A-10s had been diverted from another mission specifically to provide close air support for the rescue. It had been a perfectly coordinated operation that saved their lives. As they approached Bagram, Jake reflected on how close they'd come to disaster. The helicopter crash had been the result of mechanical failure, not enemy action, but they'd flown directly into an ambush. The enemy had been waiting for them, suggesting intelligence about their flight path. Someone would need to investigate how their mission details had been compromised, but that was a problem for intelligence officers and senior commanders. The rescue helicopter touched down on the Bagram flight line, and Jake's team was immediately whisked away for medical evaluation and debriefing. Alex's wounds were minor, and the rest of them were physically unharmed but emotionally drained. They'd survived a situation that should have killed them, saved only by the skill and courage of the Guardian Angel crew and the timely arrival of A-10 support. In the days that followed, Jake learned more about what had happened. The voice he'd heard through the radio static belonged to Captain Sarah Mitchell, the pilot of Guardian Angel. She'd been monitoring emergency frequencies when Tommy's desperate transmissions broke through. Her quick thinking and aggressive flying had made the rescue possible, threading through the mountain passes under fire to reach their position. The investigation into the helicopter crash revealed that they'd been the victims of a sophisticated ambush. Enemy fighters had been monitoring American radio frequencies and had advanced knowledge of their flight path. The mechanical failure that Jake had noticed was actually the result of sabotage. Someone at Bagram had been providing information to the enemy, and they'd found a way to damage the helicopter before takeoff. The saboteur turned out to be a civilian contractor working in helicopter maintenance. He'd been compromised by enemy agents and had been providing flight schedules and sabotaging aircraft for months. His actions had resulted in the deaths of 12 American service members before he was caught. Jake's mission had been intended as another casualty, but the professionalism of his crew and the skill of the Guardian Angel team had prevented that outcome. Jake recommended his entire crew for commendations, and they all received medals for their actions under fire. Tommy received the Bronze Star for his radio work that enabled the rescue. Maria got the Army Commendation Medal for her medical skills and covering fire, and Alex received the Purple Heart for his wounds. Jake himself was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his emergency landing and leadership during the ground defense. The contractor responsible for the sabotage was court-martialed and sentenced to life in prison. The investigation revealed an extensive network of enemy agents operating within American bases, leading to a major security overhaul. Jake's near-death experience had uncovered a serious breach that might have cost many more lives if left undiscovered. Sometimes the worst situations lead to the most important discoveries. Captain Sarah Mitchell became something of a legend after the rescue. Her willingness to fly into heavy enemy fire to save Jake's crew exemplified the Guardian Angel motto, "These things we do, that others may live." She continued flying rescue missions throughout her deployment, saving dozens of lives and earning the respect of every pilot in the theater. Her voice through the radio static had been the difference between life and death for Jake's crew. Jake returned to flying after a brief period of recovery, but he never forgot the lesson of that foggy Tuesday morning. Trust your instincts, take care of your crew, and never give up hope even when the situation seems impossible. The voice of Sarah Mitchell cutting through the static had saved their lives, but it was the teamwork and professionalism of his crew that had kept them alive long enough to be rescued. The crash site was later secured by American forces, and the damaged Black Hawk was recovered for investigation. The enemy fighters who had ambushed them were tracked down and eliminated in subsequent operations. The valley where they'd nearly died became a symbol of American determination and the courage of those who risk everything to save their fellow soldiers. Jake's story became part of the Guardian Angel Squadron's history, a testament to the importance of never leaving anyone behind. Years later, Jake would often think about that morning and the chain of events that led to their survival. A mechanical failure had put them in danger, but it had also exposed a serious security breach. The enemy ambush had nearly killed them, but it had also revealed the location of a major enemy position. Sometimes the worst situations contain the seeds of the best outcomes, and the voice of Sarah Mitchell through the static had been the key to their survival and ultimate victory.